The first thing I noticed about the wreckage of Hospital Station Meridian was the color. You spend enough years covering fleet engagements and border skirmishes, you get used to the gray on gray of military debris, hull plating and armor, and shattered ordnance, all of it the same dull gunmetal. But Meridian had been white, bright, clinical white, with the red and gold caduceus of the Terran Medical Service painted across her dorsal hull in strokes 40 meters tall. Even shattered, even venting frozen atmosphere through 100 breaches, the station's bones were white. It looked like someone had broken a cathedral. I am Tomas Garza. I have covered 6 conflicts for the Terran Press Corps, embedded with frontline elements from the Cassini Gate action to the Ursa Minor border dispute, and in 18 years of filing dispatches, from places no reasonable person would choose to be, I have never once struggled to begin a report. Words are my trade. I choose them the way a surgeon chooses instruments, and I set them down with the same deliberate care. But when I sat in the briefing theater of the scout frigate Laramie, watching the recovered data cores from Station Meridian play across a wall-sized display, I could not write a single word for 2 hours. I just sat there, I watched. And something inside me, something I had spent a career armoring with professional distance, went very quiet and very still, and stayed that way. I should tell you what Hospital Station Meridian was, because the name has been in so many dispatches since its then, that it risks becoming abstraction. It was not a warship. It was not a military installation. It was a Terran Medical Service orbital platform anchored in the Veil system at a stable Lagrange point between the 4th planet and its largest moon. It had been there for 11 years. Its purpose was singular: the treatment and rehabilitation of casualties from the Karis frontier, where a low-grade border conflict with the Saluri Compact had been generating a steady stream of wounded for the better part of a decade. 6,100 people were aboard Meridian when the Korath Dominion attacked. 4,200 were patients, men and women in recovery beds, in surgical theaters, in physical rehabilitation bays. Some were missing limbs. Some were in medically induced comas. Some were children, dependents of military personnel, receiving treatment for conditions the frontier's thin medical infrastructure couldn't handle. The remaining 1,900 were staff, doctors, nurses, orderlies, chaplains, maintenance crews, cafeteria workers who served reconstituted eggs to recovering soldiers and remembered their names. The station carried no weapons, none. Its defensive suite consisted of a navigational deflector array and a distress beacon. Its hull was painted white with the caduceus, as required by the Interstellar Convention on Medical Neutrality, a treaty the Korath Dominion had, signed 43 years earlier. The station broadcast its medical identification code on all standard frequencies continuously in 14 languages. The Korath knew what it was. I need you to understand that. They knew. The data cores made this beyond dispute. The Laramie had arrived in the Veil system 18 hours before I boarded. Commander Yelena Brask, the frigate's captain, had been running a routine patrol sweep when they picked up the station's automated distress signal, a signal that had been repeating, unanswered, for 9 days. When they dropped out of transit and saw the debris field, Brask made 2 decisions in rapid succession. The first was to launch recovery teams to search for survivors. The second was to recover the data cores. There were no survivors. 9 days. The distress beacon had been screaming into empty space for 9 days. The Veil system was a backwater, a medical anchorage chosen specifically because it was far from any active theater. The nearest patrol circuit was Brask's, and she had been on the far end of a 3-week loop. The Korath had chosen their target with the same cold arithmetic that defined their dying empire. Hit something that cannot fight back, in a place where no one will hear it in time. I boarded the Laramie from the press transport Alcyone, which had been shadowing Brass Patrol for a feature piece I was writing on frontier security, a piece that was never published, because what I found instead consumed every word I had in me for the next year. Commander Brask met me at the airlock. She was a compact woman, dark-haired, with the kind of controlled bearing that comes from 20 years of command in the outer systems. She did not waste words. Garza, the data cores are being processed. Briefing theater in 1 hour. You'll want to see this. She did not say more. She did not need to. I had been around the military long enough to read the thing behind a commanding officer's eyes when they have seen something that has rearranged the furniture inside them. Brask had that look. I need to tell you about the data cores now. I have thought about whether to describe what I saw, and I have decided that I must, because what followed, what Earth did, only makes sense if you understand what was on those recordings. The cores held 9 hours of continuous footage from Meridian's internal monitoring system, 1,943 cameras covering every corridor, every ward, Every surgical theater, every loading bay, the system was passive, designed for medical oversight and safety compliance. It was not a combat system. It had no reason to be a combat system, but it recorded everything. The attack began at 0347 station time. Three Korath Dominion cruisers, identified by their drive signatures as the Vashtkal, the Orenthus, and the Torek, dropped out of transit at a distance of 4,000 kilometers and closed on the station without hailing, without warning, without declaration. Their weapons were already charged. The first salvo struck Meridian's communications array. The second struck the reactor shielding. The third struck the main docking ring. The sequence was deliberate. Silence the station, cripple its power, trap everyone inside. Then they boarded. I watched the footage in the Laramie's briefing theater with Commander Brask, her executive officer, and the ship's intelligence analyst, a lieutenant named Vasquez, who had been tasked with cataloging the core contents. Vasquez had already reviewed the full 9 hours. His face had the gray, hollow look of a man who had not slept and did not expect to sleep again for a while. The boarding parties entered through 3 hull breaches on Meridian's lower decks. The Korath boarding troops wore sealed combat armor, dark gray with the angular shoulder markings of the Dominion's ground forces. They moved in squads of 8, disciplined, coordinated, covering angles and clearing rooms with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers. They were not amateurs. They were not raiders. They were regulars, trained and equipped and operating under orders. I watched a Korath boarding party enter Ward 7, the burn recovery unit, through a hull breach their cruiser had cut with a mining laser. The ward held 68 patients, most of them in recovery gel pods, sedated, unable to move. 2 nurses were on duty. I watched one of them, a woman whose name I later learned was Corporal Adeze Okonkwo, a combat medic who had transferred to Meridian after losing her left hand at Karis, stepped between the boarding party and the patients. She had no weapon. She held up her remaining hand, palm forward, the universal gesture. Stop! These are wounded. This is a hospital. The Korath squad leader shot her through the chest at a distance of 2 meters. The camera angle showed her falling. It showed the squad leader stepping over her body. It showed the rest of the squad moving into the ward, among the gel pods, and it showed what they did next, and I will not describe that in detail because the specifics serve no purpose beyond cruelty, and because the image of Adeze Okonkwo's raised hand, her only hand, is sufficient to convey what was taken. I watched them move through the ward systematically over the next 4 hours, and I will not describe what they did to the patients, because some things, once written, cannot be unwritten, and because the specifics do not matter as much as the totality. What matters is this: they knew. Every corridor was marked. Every ward was labeled. Every patient was in a bed, in a pod, in a wheelchair. The Korath boarding parties stepped over medical equipment and pushed past IV stands, walked through recovery rooms where human beings lay helpless, and they killed all of them. Every one. 6,100 people. The data cores also recorded the Korath communications. Their tactical channel was unencrypted, a detail that intelligence analysts later attributed to arrogance or to the Dominion's failing signals infrastructure, or both. The squad leaders reported to the cruisers in clipped, bureaucratic language, room cleared, sections secured, no resistance encountered, as if they were conducting an inspection rather than a massacre. But there was one exchange that I have not been able to stop hearing. It came 3 hours into the attack when a Korath officer aboard the Vasht Call queried the ground team's progress. The squad leader responded with a status report, and the officer asked a follow-up question that the translation system rendered into English with perfect, terrible clarity. Are any of them mobile? The squad leader answered. Some attempted to crawl. The officer said, complete the assignment. I sat in the Laramie's briefing theater and listened to that exchange, and I felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees, and then I realized the temperature hadn't changed. I had. Lieutenant Vasquez paused the playback. He looked at Commander Brask. She was sitting very still, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her knuckles white. She said, continue. Vasquez continued. The footage showed the Korath spending the next 5 hours completing their work, ward by ward, corridor by corridor, compartment by compartment. They checked every room. They opened every sealed door. When they found survivors hiding in maintenance crawl spaces and ventilation shafts, patients who had dragged themselves out of beds and crawled into any dark space they could reach, they pulled them out and killed them, methodically, without apparent emotion. At 12:47 station time, 8 hours and 59 minutes after the first salvo, the Korath boarding parties returned to their cruisers. The 3 ships held station for another 40 minutes. Long enough, the intelligence assessment later concluded to confirm that the station's reactor was in terminal failure and that no emergency rescue signal had been successfully transmitted. Then they departed. Before the data cores were transmitted, there was the matter of the debris field itself. Commander Brask's recovery team spent 40 hours working through the wreckage, and I went with them on the second day, suited up in a borrowed EVA rig, tethered to a shuttle, floating through what had been a hospital. The interior of Station Meridian was open to vacuum. Every compartment, every corridor, every sealed space had been breached, either by the initial attack or by the structural failures that followed. The emergency bulkheads had held in some sections, buying the occupants behind them perhaps an hour of breathable air before those sections too failed. The Laramie's medical officer, a quietly competent woman named Dr. Kessler, told me that the patients in sealed compartments would have suffocated gradually as the air recyclers lost power and the oxygen ran out. She said it factually. She said it the way you'd describe any clinical process. But I noticed that she did not make eye contact while she said it, and that her hands were shaking inside her gloves. I saw the wards. I saw the gel pods, cracked open and empty. I saw the surgical theaters, their equipment still powered by backup batteries, displays still showing patient vitals that had flatlined 9 days ago. I saw personal effects drifting in the corridors. A child's drawing, rendered in bright crayons, taped to a wall outside the pediatric ward, showing a figure in a hospital bed with a smiling face and the words, "Get." Well, Daddy, in unsteady letters. The tape had held, the wall had held, the child was gone. I saw the cafeteria, meal trays still on the tables, their contents frozen solid in the vacuum. A coffee cup with a name written on it in marker, Wren, drifting slowly near the ceiling, rotating in the negligible air current from a leaking seal. Someone named Wren had been having coffee at 0347 station time, and then they were not having coffee anymore, and the cup survived them. I saw Ward 7. I saw the doorway where Corporal Okonkwo had stood. There was a mark on the floor, a dark, frozen stain that Dr. Kessler confirmed was blood, Okonkwo's blood. It had pooled and frozen in the time between the breach and the total depressurization, and it was still there, a permanent record on the deck plates of the place where a nurse had died defending her patients. I floated in that doorway for several minutes, looking at that stain, and I understood something about the difference between information and experience. I had watched the footage. I had seen Okonkwo fall, but standing in the doorway, looking at the place where she had stood, where she had made her choice without hesitation, without any realistic chance of success, because the patients behind her were wounded and she was their nurse, that was something else. That was the geography of courage, and it was a small doorway on a ruined station, and it was enough. The recovery teams found no survivors. They found 4,327 bodies, the rest were unrecoverable, lost to the vacuum through hull breaches or destroyed in the reactor failures that followed. The attack. Each body was documented, photographed, identified where possible, and logged. The process took 37 hours. Commander Brask supervised it personally, sleeping in 2-hour intervals in her ready room, insisting on reviewing every identification entry before it was finalized. She did not explain why she did this. I think she felt she owed them the accuracy. They left the distress beacon running. The assessment team concluded this was not an oversight. The Korath wanted the station found. They wanted someone to see what they had done. It was intended as a message, not to Earth, but to the Korath Dominion's neighbors, the smaller species on their borders who had been ignoring Dominion trade demands and territorial claims for decades. The message was, we are still capable of this. The message was received, but not by the audience they intended. Commander Brask transmitted the data cores to Fleet Command on a priority channel, unedited, with a single line of commentary. Meridian confirmed destroyed, no survivors. Data cores recovered. Contents require immediate flag-level review. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The 9 hours of footage spoke in a language that required no translation. I filed my first dispatch from the Laramie's communications bay that evening. It described the debris field, the recovery operation, the absence of survivors. I did not describe the data cores. Fleet Command had placed an immediate classification hold on the footage pending review, and I respected that hold, not because I was ordered to, but because I understood, even then, that what those recordings contained was going to change things, and that the change should come from the people authorized to act on it, not from a journalist's dispatch. But I will tell you what I wrote in my personal notebook that night, because it is the truest thing I have ever written. They killed people who were lying down. The word reached Earth within 40 hours. I do not know exactly what happened inside the chain of command during those 40 hours, and I likely never will. The classified review of the data cores was conducted at Fleet Command's Strategic Operations Center on Luna, in a room I have never been inside. What I know is what became visible from the outside, the silence. Earth did not issue a statement. The Terran government did not hold a press conference. The diplomatic corps did not file a protest with the Galactic Arbitration Commission. The Military Affairs Committee did not convene an emergency session. For 72 hours after the data cores reached Luna, there was nothing. No noise, no outrage, no speeches. The channels that normally carried the bureaucratic hum of a civilization managing its place in the galaxy went quiet as if someone had pulled a plug. I had seen Earth angry before. I had covered the aftermath of the Karis ambush, when 12 patrol ships were destroyed in a Siluri trap, and the public response had been immediate and loud. Protests, editorials, congressional hearings, a formal demand for reparations that took 8 months to negotiate. That was anger. It was public and messy and human, and it resolved, as anger usually does, into a process. What I witnessed after Meridian was not anger. It was something else entirely. The silence was the first sign. I learned, months later, from sources I will not name, fragments of what happened during those 72 hours. The data cores reached Luna at 0200 Terran Standard. They were reviewed first by the Intelligence Directorate, then by the Chief of Fleet Operations, then by the Joint Chiefs, then by the civilian leadership. Each review took several hours. Each review ended the same way. The reviewer sitting in silence, the footage still running on the display, the room very still. The Secretary General of the Terran government, a woman named Elsbeth Morrow, watched the footage in her private office at 1400 on the second day. She watched it alone. When it ended, she called the Chief of Fleet Operations and said 4 words, "What do we have?" The Chief told her. She said, "Send it." The Chief asked, "All of it." She said, "All of it." The public learned about Meridian on the 3rd day when the government released a statement, not a press conference, not a live address, but a written statement, posted to the official channels without fanfare. It was 112 words long. It described the attack. It named the station. It gave the casualty count. It did not describe the data cores. It did not mention the fleet movements that were already underway. It ended with a sentence that I read 7 times. Earth has received this information and will act accordingly. Will act accordingly. 5 words that contained no threat, bluster, no emotion. 5 words that, in retrospect, were the most terrifying thing any government had ever published, because accordingly meant in a manner that corresponds to what was done. And what was done was the murder of 6,100 patients in their beds. The public reaction was subdued. I expected outrage, marches, demands, the kind of performative fury that modern civilizations are good at generating. Instead, there was a quietness that reminded me of the Laramie's briefing theater. People read the statement. People absorbed the number 6,100. People went back to their routines. But something was different in the way they moved through their days, something I could feel but not quantify. A journalist colleague on Earth, Margot Hale, told me later that the morning after the statement was released, the commuter trains in Sao Paulo were silent, not quiet. Silent. An entire city's morning commute conducted without conversation. She said it was the most unsettling thing she had ever experienced. The second sign was the fleet movements. I was still aboard the Laramie when Commander Brask received orders to hold position in the Veil system and await attachment to an incoming task force. She read the orders, looked at her executive officer, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Get the ship to condition to," and walked off the bridge. I found her later in the officers' mess, drinking coffee, staring at the bulkhead. I asked her what the orders meant. She said, "They're not sending a task force, Garza. They're sending a Pyre." I didn't understand the term at the time. I learned later that Pyre was the operational designation used by Terran Fleet Command for a specific category of response, not a battle group, not a task force, not a carrier strike element, but a full-spectrum punitive deployment. The term was old. It dated back to the early colonial wars, when Earth had been forced to answer provocations from species that mistook human patience for weakness. A Pyre was not sent to negotiate. It was not sent to establish a blockade or enforce a ceasefire or create conditions for diplomatic resolution. A Pyre was sent to dismantle. There had been 8 before. The 9th Pyre would be the largest. I asked Brask how she knew that was what was coming. She took a long drink of her coffee, set the cup down, and said, "Because when the order came down, it didn't say prepare for operations. It said prepare for Meridian's answer. That's a Pyre designation. Named operations are Pyres." She looked at me. They named it after the station, Garza. They named the operation after the hospital. That means someone at Fleet Command watched those data cores and decided that the only Appropriate answer is one that the galaxy will remember for a very long time. She was right. The Ninth Pyre assembled in 72 hours. 8,000 warships, drawn from every sector command, every reserve flotilla, every training squadron that could be stripped without leaving a critical gap in Earth's defensive posture. Battleships and cruisers and destroyers and frigates and fleet tenders and hospital ships, the last of which struck me as a detail of such pointed symbolism that I almost suspected someone in planning had arranged it deliberately, though I later learned it was standard doctrine. A pyre carried its own medical capability because it expected to take casualties. It simply expected to inflict more. The logistics alone were staggering. I obtained figures later from the Fleet Supply Command. 14 million tons of ordnance loaded across 8,000 ships. 612,000 personnel activated from reserve status. 46 capital ships redeployed from standing assignments. The fuel expenditure for the transit phase alone exceeded the entire annual budget of the Veil System's medical operations, a comparison I did not include in my published account because it felt too precise, too pointed, too much like rubbing a fact into a wound, but I include it here. I was transferred from the Laramie to the flagship of the Ninth Pyre's lead element by shuttle on the third day. The flagship was the TFS Viaticum, a Resolute-class dreadnought, 900 meters of angular gray hull, bristling with weapons arrays that had been designed for fleet engagements against peer state adversaries. The Korath Dominion was not a peer state. It was a decaying empire of 12 colony worlds and a military that had been declining for a century. The Viaticum alone could have reduced any single Korath installation to slag. Earth sent 8,000 ships. The disproportion was the point. I understood that immediately. This was not a military response calibrated to the threat. It was a statement, a sentence. The Korath had killed 6,100 helpless people on a marked hospital station, and Earth's answer was to send a force so overwhelming that the outcome was not a question. The only question, was how long it would take. I met Rear Admiral Nadia Sorokin on the bridge of the Viaticum 6 hours after I came, aboard. She was 58 years old, gray-haired, square-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had been designed for the bridge of a warship, all planes and angles, nothing soft. She had commanded the 7th Fleet's Heavy Division for 4 years and had a reputation for methodical precision that bordered on obsessive. She did not give speeches. She did not raise her voice. When I introduced myself and explained that I was the embedded correspondent for the Ninth Pyre's lead element, she looked at me with pale eyes that held no particular emotion and said, "You will have access to all unclassified areas of the ship and all tactical briefings below flag level. You will not interfere with operations. You will not transmit dispatches without clearance from my communications officer. Is that understood?" I said it was. She nodded. "Good. Welcome aboard, Mr. Garza. I suggest you find a seat that's bolted down. We transit in 4 hours. I did not expect to see the data core footage again aboard the Viaticum, but I did. Admiral Sorokin ordered it played for the ship's entire complement, all 3,200 crew. In the main hangar bay, the only space large enough to hold them. She did not introduce the footage. She did not provide context. She simply ordered the crew assembled, had the footage projected on the hangar's main display, and stood at the back of the bay with her hands clasped behind her back while 9 hours of recordings played at accelerated speed, compressed to 40 minutes. I stood near the back as well, watching the crew as much as the footage. I had already seen it. I knew what was coming. But watching it again, in a room full of 3,200 men and women who were about to transit to the Korath's home systems, was a different experience. The room was silent, not the restless silence of an audience waiting for something to end, but the deep structural silence of people who are being changed by what they see. I watched faces. I watched hands. I watched a gunnery sergeant in the third row close his eyes during the Ward 7 sequence and open them again 30 seconds later, his jaw set, his breathing controlled. I watched a young sensor operator cover her mouth and then deliberately lower her hand and keep watching. I watched 3,200 people absorb something that could not be unseen. When the footage ended, Admiral Sorokin walked to the front of the bay. She stood in the residual glow of the blank display and said 5 words. "We transit in 2 hours. Then she left, no explanation, no exhortation, no appeal to duty or revenge or justice. The footage was the explanation. It was sufficient. I spoke to crew members in the corridors afterward. A gunnery sergeant named Mateo Ruiz, 20-year veteran, told me, "I've been in the fleet since I was 19. I've fired on hostiles. I've been fired on. I know what war is." But that wasn't war. That was butchery. I don't need the admiral to tell me why we're going. He paused and looked at his hands, broad, steady, mechanical in their stillness, and said, "They killed people who couldn't stand up." A surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair, who ran the Viaticum surgical unit, told me something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I spent 3 years at Meridian. I rotated off 18 months ago. I knew those nurses. I knew a days." She stopped and breathed and continued, with the careful composure of someone who has decided that breaking down is something she will do later, in private, on her own terms. The Korath had our medical codes. They had our frequency. They walked past the signs. They stepped over the patients. This wasn't a military action. This was a species looking at helpless people and deciding they didn't matter. She met my eyes. "We are going to teach them what matters." A chaplain, Father Diego Restrepo, told me something quieter. He said, "I've been praying since we came aboard. Not for victory, we don't need prayers for that. Praying for the crew, for what this will do to them. Killing is a weight, Mr. Garza, even when the killing is justified. These men and women are about to carry a weight, and some of them will carry it for the rest of their lives." He paused, but I watched that footage, and I will tell you something that a chaplain probably shouldn't say. There are acts that demand an answer, and the answer to Meridian is the ninth Pyre, and I believe that with everything I have. The transit to Korath space took 11 days. 11 days of quiet preparation aboard 8,000 ships, moving through compressed space in a formation so vast that the fleet's navigational computers had to coordinate jump schedules in rolling waves to prevent transit wake interference. I had covered fleet movements before. I had never seen anything like the ninth Pyre. The scale was difficult to comprehend even from inside it. From the Viaticum's observation gallery, I could see the nearest escort vessels, a screen of destroyers holding station at 20-kilometer intervals, and beyond them, the gray shapes of cruisers and battleships stretching to the edge of visual range, each one trailing the faint blue glow of compressed space drives. The fleet filled the transit corridor like a river filling a canyon, a current of metal and purpose flowing toward a destination that everyone aboard knew and no one discussed with anything resembling hesitation. What struck me most during those 11 days was the absence of rhetoric. In every conflict I had covered, the transit phase was marked by some form of collective emotional preparation. Speeches from commanders, messages from political leaders, chaplains holding services, crew members writing letters home, the usual human machinery of war. Aboard the Viaticum, and on every ship I later interviewed crew from, there was almost none of that. People prepared. They ran drills. They maintained equipment. They ate. They slept. They reviewed targeting packages and logistics schedules and medical protocols. But they did not talk about why they were going. They did not need to. The footage had done the talking. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was consensus. I spent the transit days walking the ship. The Viaticum was a city in miniature, 900 meters of corridors and compartments and workspaces, populated by people doing the specific technical work of preparing to dismantle a civilization's military. In the Fire Control Center, weapons officers ran simulation after simulation, refining targeting solutions for Korath defense platforms they had never seen in person but knew intimately from intelligence data. In the fighter bays, maintenance crews checked every seal on every interceptor, logged every discrepancy, replaced every component that fell below tolerance. In the galley, cooks prepared meals for 3,200 people with the same methodical efficiency they would have applied on any other deployment, because hunger does not care about context, and the body requires fuel regardless of what the mind is processing. I found stories everywhere. A fire control technician named Joris van den Berg, a quiet Dutchman with steady hands and an engineer's precision, told me that his sister had been a physical therapist on Meridian. She had specialized in spinal rehabilitation, helping soldiers relearn how to walk after battlefield injuries. She'd been on the station for 4 years. Her name was Aniki. She was 31. She had sent Joris a message 2 weeks before the attack, telling him about a patient who had taken his first unassisted steps after 8 months of therapy. She was so happy in that message, Joris told me. He was calibrating a targeting array while he spoke, his hands moving with absolute precision, not a tremor. She loved that work. She loved those patients. And the Korath walked into her ward and killed every one of them, and they killed her too. He finished the calibration, checked the readout, made a minute adjustment. "I am going to do my job very well, Mr. Garza. I am going to make sure that every firing solution I calculate is perfect, not because I am angry, because Anaki would have done her job perfectly, and I owe her that." I met a Marine corporal in the hangar bay, a young woman named Diaz, who was cleaning her rifle with the focused attention of someone performing a religious ritual. She had been on the Karis frontier 2 years earlier and had been treated at Meridian for shrapnel wounds in her left leg. They saved my leg, she said simply. The surgeon, Dr. Kareem, worked on me for 11 hours. 11 hours. I met him in the cafeteria afterward, and he bought me a cup of terrible coffee and told me I'd be running within a year. She reassembled the rifle with smooth, practiced movements. I was running within 8 months, Doctor. Kareem was still on Meridian when the Korath hit it. She snapped the last component into place. I don't know if he was one of the ones who crawled. She looked at me. I think about that. I think about Dr. Kareem crawling, trying to get away, and I think about the fact that someone pulled him out of wherever he was hiding and killed him. She stood up, slung the rifle. We're 11 days out. That's 11 days of thinking about it. That's enough. On the 6th day of transit, I attended a memorial service organized by Father Restrepo in one of the Viaticum's common spaces. It was voluntary, unofficial, and attended by over 400 crew members, more than could fit in the space, so people stood in the corridor outside, listening through the open hatch. Restrepo read the names, all of them, 1,900 staff and 4,200 patients, each name spoken aloud, one after another, for over 3 hours. He did not pause. He did not skip names he could not pronounce. He worked through each one with careful attention, and the room was still, and when he finished, no one moved for a long time. I did not write about the memorial in my published account. It felt private. But I am writing about it now because I think it matters. Because those names, spoken aloud aboard a warship in transit, turned a casualty count back into what it actually was. 6,100 individual human beings, each one a life, each one a name, each one a story that the Korath had ended. I attended 3 tactical briefings during the transit. They were clinical affairs, conducted in a planning room adjacent to the bridge by Admiral Sorokin's operations staff. A group of officers who presented information with the emotional register of people discussing municipal infrastructure. The Korath Dominion maintained military installations on all 12 of their colony worlds, plus a central naval facility at their homeworld, Korath Prime. Total military assets, approximately 900 warships, most of them aging cruisers and patrol craft, plus orbital defense platforms of varying capability, ground-based air defense networks, missile installations, command and control nodes. The targeting packages were comprehensive. Every installation catalog, every defense system mapped, every orbital trajectory calculated. The 9th Pyre would enter Korath space in 12 simultaneous task groups, one for each colony world, with a 13th, the lead element, built around the Viaticum, assigned to Korath Prime. The operation was designated Meridian's Answer. I noted the name without comment. Someone in planning had a sense of symmetry. The operations officer, Captain Henrik Joss, presented the rules of engagement with the same flat professionalism he applied to everything else. Military installations were targets. Civilian infrastructure was not. Population centers were to be avoided. Any Korath military vessel that powered down its weapons and transmitted a surrender code would be disabled and bypassed, not destroyed. Any vessel that continued to resist would be eliminated. The objective was the complete dismantlement of the Korath Dominion's military capability. Not its population, not its cities, not its ability to exist, its ability to wage war. I raised my hand during the 3rd briefing and asked Captain Joss a question that had been forming in my mind since I came aboard. Captain, what is the expected duration of military operations? He looked at me with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite patience. Mr. Garza, the Korath Dominion's total military capacity is approximately 900 vessels, most of which are patrol weight. We are arriving with 8,000 warships, including 46 capital ships. The expected duration of active combat operations is, he paused and checked his datapad, though I suspected he already knew, between 6 and 14 hours, depending on the degree of resistance. 6 to 14 hours. The Korath had spent 9 hours killing patients in hospital beds. Earth's fleet would spend roughly the same amount of time dismantling their entire military. I wrote that in my notebook and underlined it twice. On the 9th day of transit, I had dinner with Admiral Sorokin in her quarters. This was unusual. She was not a social commander, and she had shown no particular interest in my presence beyond the initial briefing. But she sent a message through her aide, and I accepted, and I sat across from her at a small table in a spare, functional room and ate fleet standard rations, and drank reconstituted coffee, and listened to her say things I do not believe she said to anyone else. She began with logistics. The fleet's fuel consumption was within projected parameters. The targeting packages had been finalized. The rules of engagement had been distributed to all task group commanders. She spoke about these things with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything, and I wrote them down. And then she stopped talking about logistics and said something that made me put down my pen. I have commanded warships for 26 years, Mr. Garza. I have ordered weapons fired. I have watched ships die. Ours and theirs. I am not unfamiliar with violence or its consequences. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. But I have never commanded an operation where the outcome was predetermined. In every engagement I have fought, there was uncertainty. The enemy might be stronger than our intelligence suggested. Our weapons might malfunction. A tactical situation might develop that our plans hadn't anticipated. There was always a margin, however thin, for things to go wrong. She looked at me. There is no such margin here. The Korath cannot stop us. They cannot slow us meaningfully. They cannot inflict enough damage to alter the outcome. This is not a battle we are transiting toward. It is a demolition, and I find that I am less comfortable with certainty than I was with uncertainty. I asked her what she meant. In uncertain engagement, the violence is justified by the risk. You fight because the outcome is in doubt, and fighting is the only way to resolve it. Here, there is no doubt. We will arrive. We will destroy their military capability. They will not be able to prevent it. The only question is whether we should. She set the cup down, and that question was answered on the data cores. You're going to ask me why, she said then, shifting register. Everyone does. Why this response? Why this scale? Why not diplomatic channels, sanctions, a targeted strike on the 3 cruisers that did it? I said I was in fact going to ask her that. She set down her utensils. The 3 cruisers that attacked Meridian were instruments. They carried out orders that came from the Korath Military Command, which operates under the authority of the Dominion government. The decision to attack a marked hospital station was not made by 3 ships. It was made by a civilization, and Earth's response is directed at the civilization. Some would say it's disproportionate. It is disproportionate. That is the entire point. She picked up her coffee. Proportional responses are negotiations. They say, you did this, we did something equivalent, now let's discuss terms. We are not negotiating, we are establishing a fact. The fact is that attacking a Terran medical facility carries a cost so high that no rational actor would ever consider it again. She drank. The Korath are not the audience, Mr. Garza. The galaxy is the audience. Every species that has ever looked at a Terran hospital ship and calculated whether the patients inside were worth more as hostages or as corpses, they are the audience. And the show they are about to see will run once, and it will be sufficient. I asked her if she had watched the data core footage. 3 times, she said. Once on Luna, during the flag review, once aboard this ship, when I showed it to the crew, and once alone in this room at this table with the lights off. She looked at me. I watched Corporal Okonkwo raise her hand. I watched a woman with one hand stand between a squad of armed soldiers and 68 patients who could not move, and I watched her die for it, and I decided something. She did not tell me what she had decided. She did not need to. I was sitting aboard the Answer. The 9th Pyre dropped out of transit at the edge of Korath space on the 12th day. I was on the Viaticum's bridge when it happened, standing in the press alcove, a small section of the bridge set aside for embedded correspondence, equipped with a display that mirrored the main tactical feed. The transition from compressed space to normal space was marked by the usual sensory disruption, a moment of visual distortion, a pressure in the ears, a brief vertigo. Then the stars steadied, and the main display filled with data. Korath Prime was visible through the forward viewport, a large, rust-colored world with thin bands of cloud and a single small moon. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of planet you might pass without a second glance on a survey mission. There was nothing about it that suggested it was the seat of an empire, decaying or otherwise. It was just a world whose government had decided 11 days ago that killing 6,100 helpless human beings on a hospital station was an acceptable use of its declining military resources. Admiral Sorokin stood at the command station in the center of the bridge, her hands resting on the railing, her eyes on the display. Around her, the bridge crew worked with the focused efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in simulation. Sensor operators tracked contacts. Communications officers monitored frequencies. Weapon stations confirmed targeting solutions. Everything moved with the smooth, interlocking precision of a mechanism that had been built for exactly this purpose. The Korath knew we were coming. Their intelligence apparatus, whatever remained of it, had detected the fleet's transit signature days earlier. By the time we arrived, their military was at full alert, such as it was. The orbital defense platforms around Korath Prime were active, their weapons charged. A screen of 63 Korath warships had formed a defensive line between the planet and the fleet's approach vector. Their formations were tight, their weapons hot. They intended to fight. 63 ships against the 1,300 in our task group alone. Admiral Sorokin studied the tactical display for a long moment. Then she turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to the Korath Defense Command. All frequencies. The officer complied. Channel open, Admiral. Sorokin spoke without raising her voice. Her tone was the same flat, measured cadence she used for everything. Korath Defense Command. This is Rear Admiral Nadia Sorokin, Terran Combined Fleet commanding the Ninth Pyre. Your government ordered the destruction of Hospital Station Meridian in the Vale system 11 days ago. 6,100 patients and medical personnel were killed in an attack on a clearly marked humanitarian facility. Earth has received and reviewed the station's data core recordings in their entirety. She paused for exactly one breath. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to discuss. We are here to remove your ability to do this again. Any military vessel that powers down its weapons and transmits a surrender code on this frequency will be disabled and bypassed. Any vessel or installation that remains active will be destroyed. You have 4 minutes to comply. Sorokin out. She nodded to the communications officer. The channel closed. She turned back to the tactical display and clasped her hands behind her back and waited. I watched the Korath formation on the display. 63 contacts holding position, weapons hot. For 2 minutes, nothing changed. Then, one by one, 7 contacts began powering down, their weapon signatures dimming on the tactical feed, their transponders switching to the surrender frequency. 7 out of 63. The remaining 56 held their ground. At the 4-minute mark, Admiral Sorokin said comments. The Viaticum's bridge did not erupt into chaos. There was no shouting, no dramatic countdowns, no clenched fists or gritted teeth. The weapons officer said batteries 1 through 16, firing solutions confirmed, engaging. The tactical display lit with outgoing fire. Hundreds of weapons tracks reaching from the task group's formation toward the Korath defensive line, like threads being drawn taut. The sensor operator called out contacts as they went dark. Contact 14 destroyed. Contact 22 destroyed. Contact 31 destroyed. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to eliminate 56 Korath warships and 14 orbital defense platforms. The 7 vessels that had surrendered drifted in their orbits, dark and powerless, their crews alive. The rest were expanding clouds of debris, cooling in the light of Korath Prime's sun. I stood in the press alcove and watched the tactical display clear, contact by contact, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not horror, not the complicated mix of adrenaline and dread that I had felt during other engagements. I felt the same thing I had felt since the briefing theater on the Laramie, the same cold stillness that had settled into me when I heard the Korath officer say, "Complete the assignment," and felt the temperature change. I understood in that moment that I was not covering a battle, I was covering a consequence. The orbital defense platforms were next. Automated systems, most of them stubborn in their programming, continuing to fire even as the task group's cruisers systematically reduced them to scrap. The last platform went dark 43 minutes after the engagement began. Korath Prime's orbital space was clear. Then the ground campaign began, though campaign is too grand a word for what happened. The Korath maintained 7 military installations on the surface of their homeworld, 3 naval command centers, 2 missile complexes, a fighter base, and a ground force headquarters. Each one had been mapped in advance. Each one received a precision orbital strike, not area bombardment, not carpet bombing, but targeted fire directed at military structures with the surgical accuracy that Terran weapons systems were designed to deliver. I watched the ground strikes from the Viaticum's observation gallery, which offered a direct view of Korath Prime's surface through a reinforced viewport 20 meters wide. The planet filled the view, its rust-colored continents, its thin cloud bands, its scattered settlements visible as pale clusters against the darker terrain. When the strikes began, I saw them as pinpoints of white light blooming on the surface, each one lasting no more than a second, each one precisely placed, each one followed by a column of smoke and dust that rose through the atmosphere in a thin, straight line. 7 targets, 7 blooms of light, 7 columns. The entire sequence took 17 minutes. From orbit, it looked almost gentle, brief flashes, like distant camera flashes at a concert. From the ground, each of those flashes was the complete destruction of a military facility that had taken decades to build. Standing next to me in the gallery was the ship's senior weapons officer, Commander Patel, a precise, quiet man who had overseen the targeting calculations for the ground strikes. He watched the columns rise through the atmosphere and said, without inflection, 17 minutes. All 7 targets confirmed destroyed. No strikes within 3 kilometers of civilian structures. Collateral assessment teams will deploy within the hour. He paused. Clean. Clean. It was a weapons officer's word, not a moral judgment. It meant the strikes had hit what they were aimed at and nothing else. It meant the mathematics had held. It meant 3,200 people on a warship had done their jobs with the precision that their training demanded, and the result was 7 installations reduced to rubble and 0 civilian casualties. Clean. When the smoke cleared, and the smoke was visible from orbit, thin columns rising through the planet's thin atmosphere into the daylight, the Korath Dominion's military presence on their homeworld had ceased to exist. But I also saw something else from the gallery, something that the tactical displays did not show. As the last column of smoke began to thin, I saw a cluster of lights on the surface, the nearest Korath settlement, perhaps 30 kilometers from the closest strike zone, and I saw those lights stay on. Power grids operating, water systems pumping, traffic moving, life continuing. The ninth Pyre had visited destruction on the planet below, and the civilization that lived there was, in every way that mattered to the people in those houses and offices and schools, untouched. The military was gone. Everything else remained. Civilian infrastructure was untouched. Cities were intact. Power grids continued to function. Water systems operated normally. The Korath population went about their lives in their homes and their workplaces and their markets, and above them the sky was different, and they knew it. Reports began arriving from the other task groups within hours. The ninth Pyre had entered Korath space simultaneously across all 12 colony systems, and the pattern was the same everywhere. Brief, lopsided engagements. Korath forces outmatched by margins so vast that the word battle felt inaccurate. Some colonies had mounted more resistance than others. The garrison at Korath Tertius, a mining world in the outer systems, had fought with a desperation that cost the task group 2 frigates and a destroyer before being overwhelmed. Their commander had refused to surrender, had rallied his forces around the system's largest orbital station, and had fought until his last ship was burning. I was told later that Admiral Sorokin received this news without comment, and that when asked if she wished to make a notation in the operational log regarding the Korath commander's conduct, she said, "He fought. Note that he fought. That is all he earned." At Korath Quintus, a garrison world that housed the Dominion's primary training academy, the task group encountered a fleet of 41 cadet vessels, training ships crewed by students, some of them barely old enough to serve. The cadets had been ordered to defend the academy. They formed a ragged line across the approach vector, their ships barely armed, their formations unsteady, their transponders broadcasting identification codes that the fleet's intelligence officers recognized immediately as training designations. The task group commander, Captain Yunsun Ho of the battleship Ironwood, paused for 9 minutes. He opened a channel to the cadet fleet and told them, in a voice that I later heard on the operational recording, "This is Captain Yun of the Terran battleship Ironwood. You were in training vessels. You are not combatants. Power down your weapons and withdraw to the Academy's civilian landing field. You will not be harmed. You have my word." 8 of the 41 cadets powered down. The remaining 33 held formation. Captain Yun waited 2 more minutes. Then he ordered his ships to fire disabling shots, targeting engines and weapons arrays, not hulls. 27 cadet ships were disabled. 6 were destroyed when their reactor containment failed under fire. 34 cadet crews survived. 6 did not. Captain Yun logged the engagement and noted the 6 dead cadets, by name, which he obtained from the disabled ship's manifests. His log entry read, "These were children sent to die by old men who were not present. Log their names. They deserve that." The garrison at Korath Septimus had surrendered without firing a shot, their commander broadcasting a message that the translation system rendered as, "We did not choose this. We did not support this. Please." That message was logged and filed and did not change the operational plan. The Septimus garrison's military installations were dismantled from orbit with the same precision applied everywhere else. Their personnel were permitted to evacuate first, but the installations themselves, the hangars, the weapons depots, the command bunkers, the orbital platforms were reduced to rubble. The ability was the target, not the people, the ability. At Korath Duodecimus, the outermost colony, the task group found something unexpected. A Korath civilian broadcast, transmitted on open channels, showing footage of the Station Meridian attack. The broadcast had been compiled by a Korath journalist, or the Korath equivalent, and it included the data core footage that Earth had released to the Galactic Arbitration Commission the previous week, along with commentary in the Korath language that the fleet's translators rendered as condemnation. The journalist was denouncing the Restoration Circle, naming the officers who had ordered the attack, calling for their public trial. The broadcast had been running for 3 days. The Dominion government had not shut it down, possibly because they no longer had the capability to shut it down, or possibly because they had decided that the cost of defending the attack was higher than the cost of condemning it. The task group at Duodecimus dismantled the colony's 2 military installations without resistance. The garrison had already evacuated. The broadcast continued uninterrupted throughout the operation, a chorus voice speaking to Korath citizens about what their government had done and what it had cost them, while Terran warships systematically erased the military infrastructure overhead. At Korath Nonus, a colony world known for its agricultural output, the task group encountered an unexpected complication. A Korath civilian transport convoy, 17 ships carrying refugees from the colony's population centers, attempting to transit out of the system before the fighting began. The task group commander, Captain Alia Mendez of the cruiser Sable, halted offensive operations for 47 minutes while the convoy cleared the engagement zone. The convoy was not fired upon, it was not boarded, it was not redirected, it was allowed to leave. 17 civilian transports, carrying 31,000 Korath civilians, passed through the formation of Earth warships without a single weapons lock. I learned about this incident from Captain Mendez's report, which I read weeks later. Her log entry for the 47-minute pause was characteristically brief. Civilian convoy transiting engagement zone. Holding fire. These are not combatants. Resuming operations upon clearance. The contrast was not lost on me. The Korath had boarded a hospital station full of wounded patients and killed every one of them. Earth's fleet paused its dismantlement of Korath military infrastructure to let a convoy of Korath civilians pass unharmed. The two facts lived side by side, and the space between them contained everything you needed to know about the difference. By the end of the first day, the Korath Dominion's military had ceased to exist as a functional entity. 812 warships destroyed or captured, 167 orbital platforms eliminated, 94 ground installations demolished, Earth's losses, 2 frigates, 1 destroyer, and 83 personnel killed in action, all at Korath Tertius. The Dominion's ability to project force beyond its atmosphere, or, for that matter, within it, was gone, dismantled with the same efficiency that a surgeon uses to remove a tumor, precisely, completely, and without sentiment. I filed my first full combat dispatch from the Viaticum that evening. It was 1,200 words, the longest single dispatch I had ever written from an active theater, and every word of it was precise and cold and factual, because I understood that the facts were sufficient. But the story was not over. Admiral Sorokin kept the 9th Pyre in Korath space for 31 days after the last military installation was destroyed. 8,000 warships holding station in orbit around 12 worlds and a homeworld, doing nothing. Not landing troops, not occupying territory, not imposing governance. Just present, visible. A reminder written across the sky of every Korath world in gray hull plating and weapons arrays that Earth had done this once and could do it again, and that the only reason the cities below were still standing was a choice that could be revisited. During those 31 days, I conducted interviews, dozens of them. Crew members, officers, support staff, medical personnel. I spoke to people across the fleet, on ships ranging from the Viaticum to patrol corvettes to fleet tenders. I was looking for something. I wasn't sure what, a crack maybe, a moment of doubt. A voice that would say, was this too much? Did we go too far? Was 8,000 warships for one hospital station proportionate? I did not find it. What I found instead was a consistency of feeling that I can only describe as settled, not triumphant, not vengeful, not righteous, settled, as if the fleet had done something that needed doing, and now it was done. And there was nothing more to say about it. A boatswain's mate on the destroyer Kessler, a young woman named Chen, told me they killed nurses. They killed patients in beds. They walked through a hospital and murdered everyone in it. What did they think was going to happen? She said it without heat, without anger. She said it the way you might describe gravity, a fact of the physical universe. This happened, therefore, that followed. An engineering chief on the cruiser Halloran, a man in his 50s with oil-stained hands and a quiet voice, told me something different, something that got closer to the thing I was searching for. He said, I don't feel good about this, if that's what you're asking. I don't feel bad about it either. I feel like we did something necessary. The Korath made a choice. They chose to attack a hospital. They chose to kill people who couldn't fight back, and we made a choice back. Our choice was bigger. That's the part that matters. Not whether it was proportionate, not whether it was fair, whether it was big enough that nobody will ever make their choice again. Big enough. That was the phrase that stayed with me. Not justified, not righteous. Big enough. I spent 3 days on Korath Prime's surface during the occupation period, embedded with a civil affairs team that was assessing the impact of the orbital strikes on surrounding civilian areas. The team was led by Major Constance Webb, a civil affairs specialist who had spent a decade doing post-conflict assessment work and who approached the job with the meticulous detachment of an actuary. She documented everything: blast radii, debris patterns, structural damage to civilian buildings within the peripheral zone, air quality readings, water contamination levels, ground displacement. She treated the aftermath of the Ninth Pyre's orbital strikes with the same systematic rigor that the strikes themselves had been conducted with, and I found a grim symmetry in that. The damage to civilian structures was minimal. The military installations had been sited in isolated areas, as military installations usually are, and the targeting had been accurate. Major Webb's final assessment logged 17 civilian structures, with damage exceeding cosmetic level, mostly cracked walls and shattered windows from the overpressure of the strikes. No civilian casualties attributable to the orbital fire. Zero. The Ninth Pyre had dismantled 7 military installations on a populated world and killed no civilians in the process. I noted this in my dispatch without commentary, but I thought about it at length. The Korath had attacked a hospital and killed everyone inside. Earth had attacked military installations on the Korath homeworld and killed no one who wasn't shooting back. The discipline required to achieve that, the targeting precision, the rules of engagement, the restraint, was itself a statement. The Korath civilians I encountered in the nearby settlements watched us with expressions I could not easily read. Fear, certainly. Confusion. But also something else, something that I eventually identified as recognition. They knew why we were there. They knew what their government had done. And they knew that what had happened to their military was a consequence, not a random act. I walked through the settlement of Renthis on the second day, accompanied by a translator and a 2-person security detail. The settlement was small, perhaps 12,000 inhabitants, a market town that served the agricultural district surrounding it. The streets were wide and clean, lined with low buildings made of a pale, chelite-like material that caught the daylight and held it. The Korath who walked those streets gave us a wide berth but did not flee. Children watched from doorways. An elderly female, recognizable by the lighter coloring of her facial plates, stood on a corner and simply observed us for 20 minutes, motionless, her expression unreadable. I spoke to one Korath civilian through the translation device, an elderly male, a shopkeeper in Vrenthis, 3 kilometers from the ruins of what had been the Dominion's primary naval command center. He stood behind his counter, surrounded by goods I couldn't identify, and he said, "Your hospital. We heard about it. Most of us heard about it. The government said it was a military target. They said there were weapons hidden there. They said it was necessary." He paused. The translation device hummed. Nobody believed them. I asked him what he thought would happen now. He looked out the window of his shop, toward the column of smoke still rising from the Naval Command Center's ruins, and said, "I think you have made your point." I spoke to others. A younger Korath, a teacher, at what I understood to be a primary education facility, told me through the translator, "My students ask me why the ships are in the sky. I tell them the truth. I tell them that our government did something terrible, and that the people it was done to have come here to make sure it cannot happen again." She paused. "They ask if the ships will hurt us. I tell them no. I tell them the ships are not here for us. They are here for the soldiers." She looked at the sky, where the distant shapes of Terran warships were visible as dark specks against the daytime blue. I hope I am telling them the truth. She was. The ships were not there for her, or for her students, or for the shopkeeper, or for any of the civilians who looked up at the sky of their homeworld and saw a fleet that could have erased them and chose not to. The ships were there for the installations, for the capability, for the ability to do what had been done to Meridian. And when that ability was gone, the ships would leave, and the civilians would remain. And the memory of why the ships had come would stay in the sky long after the ships themselves had departed. I wrote that down. I have read it many times since. I think you have made your point. It was the most concise summary of the Ninth Pyre I ever heard, and it came from a shopkeeper on the receiving end. On the 14th day of the occupation, a Galactic Arbitration Commission delegation arrived in the Veil system, not in Korath space, but at the site of Hospital Station Meridian's wreckage, and issued a formal request for Earth to withdraw its forces and submit the matter to arbitration. The request was transmitted on diplomatic frequencies to Admiral Sorokin aboard the Viaticum. I was on the bridge when the message arrived. Admiral Sorokin read it on her personal display, her expression unchanged. Then she turned to her communications officer and said, "Acknowledge receipt. Transmit the following response. The response was 3 sentences long. I memorized it because it was the only formal statement Admiral Sorokin made during the entire operation, and because it contained, in 41 words, everything Earth intended to say about what had happened at Meridian. The Terran Combined Fleet acknowledges the Commission's request. Hospital Station Meridian was a marked humanitarian facility protected under conventions the Korath Dominion signed. Earth does not arbitrate the murder of 6,100 patients. Earth answers it. The Commission's delegation departed the Veil system without further comment. I learned, in the weeks that followed, that the Commission's response had been divided. Several member species had condemned Earth's action as disproportionate, a violation of the principle of proportional response that undergirded interstellar law. Others had remained silent. A few, notably the Siluri Compact, whose own wounded had filled many of Meridian's beds, had issued quiet statements of support through back channels. The Threnody Union, a species known for its medical traditions, transmitted a single-line message to Earth's diplomatic corps. The Caduceus is sacred. You have defended it. We will not forget. The galaxy's opinion was fractured, and I suspect it remains so. But fractured opinion and functional deterrence are different things, and it was the second one Earth was after. I should tell you about the Korath Dominion, because understanding what they were makes what happened at Meridian more explicable, if not more forgivable. The Dominion was old, older than Earth's spacefaring civilization by several centuries. They had been a regional power once, dominant in their sector, a culture of rigid hierarchy and martial tradition that had expanded aggressively for 300 years before beginning the long, slow contraction that comes to all empires that stop adapting. By the time of the Meridian attack, the Dominion was a shadow, 12 colony worlds down from a peak of 40, a military that was more legacy than capability, aging ships, outdated weapon systems, a command structure riddled with corruption and factional infighting. Their economy was contracting. Their population was declining. Their influence in galactic affairs had dwindled to near irrelevance. They were a civilization watching itself erode, and they were not handling it well. The attack on Meridian was the brainchild of a faction within the Dominion's military command, a group of officers who called themselves the Restoration Circle, and who believed that a dramatic act of force would restore the Dominion's prestige and intimidate their neighbors into granting concessions. The Circle was led by a fleet admiral named Toreth Ven, a career military officer from one of the Dominion's oldest families, a species of aristocrat soldier that had been bred for command over centuries and had never accepted the Empire's decline. Toreth Ven had written extensively, I read his writings later, in translation, about the need for what he called demonstrative action, the theory that a single, spectacular military operation could reverse decades of diminishment and restore the Dominion's position in the galactic order. His writings were cogent in their way. He understood military logistics. He understood strategic signaling. He understood the mathematics of force projection. What he did not understand, what his entire theory was blind to, was the possibility that a target might have allies who would respond not with calculation, but with something older and less negotiable. He chose Meridian because it was defenseless, and he saw defenselessness as opportunity. He did not see it as the thing that would make the response absolute. I obtained a copy of the operational order for the Meridian attack, declassified 2 years after the event. It was 4 pages long, written in standard Korath military format, and it read like a procurement document. The station was referred to throughout as the target facility. The patients were referred to as occupants. The word hospital appeared once, in a footnote acknowledging the station's medical designation, followed by the phrase operationally irrelevant. The order specified that all occupants were to be eliminated to maximize demonstrative impact. It specified that the station's data recording systems should be left intact to ensure the attack was documented. It specified that the boarding party should operate with thoroughness, a word that I read and reread and that I can no longer encounter in any context without feeling my stomach turn. Toreth Ven signed the order. 3 cruiser commanders received it. 1,200 boarding troops executed it. 6,100 people died because a declining empire's aristocrat admiral thought that killing patients in their beds would make the galaxy take his civilization seriously again. They chose Meridian specifically because it was defenseless. They chose the Veil system because it was isolated. They calculated, correctly, that they could destroy the station, withdraw, and present the act to their population as a military victory before Earth could respond. They calculated, incorrectly, that Earth's response would be diplomatic. I think about that miscalculation often. It was not a failure of intelligence. The Korath had files on Earth's military capability. They knew the numbers. They knew the firepower. What they did not understand, what they fundamentally failed to comprehend, was that numbers and firepower are not the same as will. They looked at Earth and saw a civilization that preferred diplomacy, that sought compromise, that invested heavily in medical stations and aid programs and cultural exchanges. They saw patience and mistook it for weakness. They saw restraint and mistook it for inability. They did not understand that patience and restraint are choices, and that the capacity for disproportionate, overwhelming, final response existed behind those choices, like a charge behind a dam. When the dam broke, when the data cores from Meridian played across the displays in Luna's Strategic Operations Center, the response was not proportional, because proportional was not the message Earth intended to send. The message was, this is what is behind the patience. This is what the restraint was holding back. This is what you unleashed. The Korath officers who planned the attack, the Restoration Circle, were arrested by their own government before the Ninth Pyre arrived. A gesture, perhaps an attempt to forestall what was coming, it did not work. Earth was not interested in individuals. Earth was interested in capability. The officers could be tried by their own courts. The military installations could not try themselves. They could only be dismantled. And so they were. I left the Ninth Pyre on the 28th day, transferred back to the Laramie for the return transit to Earth. The transfer shuttle crossed 40 kilometers of empty space between the Viaticum and the Laramie, and during that crossing I looked out the shuttle's viewport and saw a sight I do not think I will ever forget. 8,000 warships holding station in orbit around Korath Prime, arranged in concentric shells of gray hull and weapons array. From above, from the shuttle's altitude, they looked like a vast, deliberate pattern, a rosette of metal and purpose drawn across the sky. Each ship held its position with the automated precision of a fleet in formation, engines at station-keeping power, weapons cold, every system idling except the sensors that watched the planet below. They were not doing anything. That was the point. They were simply there, present, waiting, the most eloquent expression of restrained power I had ever witnessed. 8,000 reasons to never do this again, each one 900 meters or 70 meters or 300 meters long, each one capable of the kind of precision violence that the ground strikes had demonstrated, each one choosing in that moment not to use it. The shuttle pilot, a young ensign who had been making transfer runs between ships for 28 days, glanced at me and said, "First time seeing the formation from above, I said it was." He nodded. "I fly through it 4 times a day. I'm still not used to it. Biggest thing I've ever seen. Biggest thing anyone's ever seen, probably." He adjusted a control. My grandmother called me on the relay last week. She asked me what it was like. I told her it was like watching something that was too big to be angry, like it went past anger and out the other side into something else. He paused. She said that sounded about right. Admiral Sorokin and I spoke one final time. In her quarters, she offered me coffee, which I accepted. She sat across from me and regarded me with those pale level eyes. "You'll write about this," she said. It was not a question. "It's what I do, Admiral. Then write it accurately. Don't make it tragic. Don't make it into a story about revenge. It isn't revenge." She set her coffee down. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is personal. This was institutional. This was a civilization making a statement about what it will not tolerate. We did not do this because we were angry. We did this because what was done to Meridian was done to a facility that existed under protections that the entire galaxy agreed to uphold, and when those protections were violated, someone had to demonstrate that the agreement had teeth. She paused. "We are the teeth." I wrote that down. I have never been sure whether it was the most frightening thing I heard during the entire operation, or the most reassuring. I think it was both. I took the transfer shuttle back to the Laramie the following morning. The shuttle crossed 40 kilometers of empty space between the Viaticum and the frigate, and during that crossing I looked out the viewport and saw a sight I do not think I will ever forget. 8,000 warships, holding station in orbit around Korath Prime, arranged in concentric shells of gray hull and weapons array. From above, from the shuttle's altitude, they looked like a vast deliberate pattern, a rosette of metal and purpose drawn across the sky. Each ship held its position with the automated precision of a fleet in formation, engines at station-keeping power, weapons cold, every system idling, except the sensors that watched the planet below. They were not doing anything. That was the point. They were simply there, present, waiting. The most eloquent expression of restrained power I had ever witnessed. 8,000 reasons to never do this again, each one 900 meters or 70 meters or 300 meters long, each one capable of the kind of precision violence that the ground strikes had demonstrated, each one choosing, in that moment, not to use it. The shuttle pilot, a young ensign who had been making transfer runs between ships for 28 days, glanced at me and said, "First time seeing the full formation from above?" I said it was. He nodded. "I fly through it 4 times a day. I'm still not used to it. Biggest thing I've ever seen. Biggest thing anyone's ever seen, probably." He adjusted a control. "My grandmother called me on the relay last week. She asked me what it was like. I told her it was like watching something that was too big to be angry, like it went past anger and out the other side into something else." He paused. "She said that sounded about right." Back aboard the Laramie, Commander Brask met me at the airlock. She looked older than she had a month ago. The lines around her eyes were deeper, and there was a stillness to her that hadn't been there before, the stillness of someone who had been carrying something Heiau for a long time, and had not set it down. She said, "Welcome back, Garza. We transit home in 3 days." I filed my last dispatch from the Laramie's communications bay that evening. It was 200 words, the shortest piece I had ever written. I described the departure preparations, the fleet holding station, the silence, and I ended with a line I had been carrying in my head since the briefing theater, since the data cores, since the moment I heard a Karath officer say, "Complete the assignment," and felt the temperature change. On the morning of the transit, I stood in the Laramie's observation alcove and watched the Ninth Pyre begin its withdrawal. 8,000 ships folding into transit one by one, disappearing from the display like stars winking out. It took 4 hours for the entire fleet to depart. When the last ship, a fleet tender, bringing up the rear, made its transit, the display was empty. Korath's space was quiet. Brask was on the bridge. I was in the alcove. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Brask said, without looking at me, "You know what the Korath will remember, Garza? Not the ships, not the strikes, not the dismantlement. They'll remember the 31 days after, the month we stayed, doing nothing, saying nothing. Just there. That's what they'll remember. The silence." She was right. The silence was the message. The ships were just how it was delivered. The Ninth Pyre withdrew from Korath space on the 31st day. 8,000 warships departed in the same rolling transit waves in which they had arrived, leaving behind 12 worlds and a homeworld whose military infrastructure had been comprehensively dismantled. The Korath Dominion continued to exist as a political entity. Its population was intact. Its cities were standing. Its civilian economy, battered by the loss of military spending but otherwise functional, began the slow process of restructuring. In the months that followed, the Dominion underwent a political transformation that historians are still studying. The military government collapsed within weeks of the Ninth Pyre's departure, replaced by a civilian council that included several prominent critics of the Restoration Circle. Torith Ven and his co-conspirators were tried in a Korath court, not a Terran one, not a galactic one, and convicted of crimes that the Korath legal system had never previously codified. The court invented a charge, provocation of civilizational consequence. Torith Ven was sentenced to permanent confinement. He died in a cell 7 years later, by which time his name had become, in the Korath language, a synonym for catastrophic miscalculation. But the Dominion never rebuilt its military, not because it was prohibited. Earth imposed no terms, signed no treaty, established no occupation force. There was no peace agreement because Earth did not consider the operation a war. It was, in Admiral Sorokin's word, a statement. The Dominion never rebuilt because there was nothing to rebuild toward. Their military had been constructed over centuries to project power, and the Ninth Pyre had demonstrated that the power they projected was irrelevant. That in the face of what Earth could bring to bear, their 900 ships and their orbital platforms and their ground installations were a gesture that had been answered with such finality that repeating it was unthinkable. The Korath, in the years that followed, turned inward. They invested in civilian infrastructure, in agriculture, in education. They reopened trade relations with neighboring species. They applied for observer status at the Galactic Arbitration Commission, the same body whose intervention Earth had rejected during the operation. Some analysts have described this as a positive outcome. A dying empire forced to stop spending itself into oblivion on a military it couldn't afford and didn't need. Others have described it as a humiliation, a once proud civilization broken by a force it couldn't resist. I suspect both descriptions are accurate, and that the truth lies in the space between them, where most truth lives. There's one more thing I should record about the aftermath, because it speaks to something that I have struggled to articulate, and that I think matters. 6 months after the Ninth Pyre, the Terran Medical Service commissioned a new hospital station to replace Meridian. It was built in the same Lagrange point in the Veil system, at the same coordinates, in the same orbit. It was named Station Meridian 2. It was white, with the red and gold caduceus painted across its dorsal hull. It carried no weapons. Its first commanding medical officer was Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Adese's sister, also a military nurse, who had requested the assignment. She stood on the station's observation deck on its commissioning day, looking out at the same stars her sister had seen, and she did not make a speech because the station itself was the speech. I was there for the commissioning. I stood at the back of the observation deck, notebook in hand, and I watched Dr. Okonkwo look out at the Veil system, and I understood that this, the new station, the white hull, the red cross, the deliberate return to the exact spot where 6,100 people had been murdered, was the other half of the message. The Ninth Pyre was what happened when you touched the wounded. Station Meridian 2 was what happened after. The refusal to be deterred, the insistence on rebuilding exactly what was destroyed in exactly the same place, as if to say, we were here before and we are here again, and we will always be here, and you know what happens if you try this again. I returned to Earth and wrote the definitive account of the Ninth Pyre. It was published as a 12-part series in the Terran Press Syndicate, and was read, I am told, by more people than anything I had previously written. I won awards for it. I accepted them with the same flat, settled feeling that had accompanied me since the briefing theater on the Laramie. But here is what I actually think about when I think about the Ninth Pyre, not the fleet, not the strikes, not the statistics or the logistics or the political aftermath. I think about Adise Okonkwo. I think about a woman who had already given a hand to the frontier, literally given it, lost it in the same conflict that filled Meridian's beds, and who, when armed soldiers walked into her ward, did the only thing she had left to do. She stood between them and her patients. She's erased at her remaining hand, she said, without words, everything that needed to be said. These are wounded. This is a hospital. You will not do this. They did it anyway. And she died in a doorway with one hand raised, and the footage survived. And 23 days later, 8,000 warships arrived at the Korath's front door. I have been asked in the years since whether the Ninth Pyre was justice. I have been asked whether it was proportionate, whether it was legal, whether it was moral. I have been asked to pass judgment on the largest military operation in Terran history, to weigh the destruction of an empire's military against the destruction of a hospital, to calculate some moral arithmetic that balances 6,100 dead patients against a civilization brought to its knees. I don't answer those questions. That is not my function. I am a correspondent. I record. I report. I set down what I saw with the precision and clarity that the facts deserve, and I let the reader do their own arithmetic. But I will tell you this. In the years since the Ninth Pyre, no one has attacked a Terran medical facility. No one has fired on a Terran hospital ship. No one has boarded a vessel bearing the caduceus. The red and gold of the Terran Medical Service became, in the parlance of naval officers I spoke to afterward, the most respected colors in the galaxy. Not because the galaxy suddenly developed a moral commitment to medical neutrality. Because the galaxy saw what happened when those colors were violated, and the galaxy did the math. 8,000 warships. For one hospital station. For 6,100 people who could not fight back. The math was very clear. And so I will close this account the way I close everything, with the facts, laid end to end, offered without commentary. Hospital Station Meridian carried no weapons. It carried patients. It carried nurses. It carried a woman named Adese Okonkwo, who stood in a doorway with one hand raised and died for it. The Ninth Pyre carried 8,000 warships. The difference between those two facts is the entire story of what happened in the Veil system. It is the warning and the promise and the law that Earth wrote not in words but in hull plating and fire and the silence that came after. Nobody has tested that law since. I don't think anybody will,